Hello everybody, today I'd like to read to you a chapter of A Little History of Economics by Niall Kishtainy. Chapter 21, The Tyranny of Government. One night, during the Second World War, two men sat on the roof of the ancient chapel of King's College, Cambridge. They'd climbed up there to protect the buildings from bombs dropped by German planes. The chapel had taken five English kings over 100 years to build. Now, the pair were going to defend it against enemy bombs using shovels. The idea was to use them to push off any bombs that landed on the roof. The intrepid duo were two of the most famous economists of the 20th century. They must have made an odd couple, though. For one thing, they were totally opposed to each other in economic thinking. The older of the two, John Maynard Keynes, whom we met in an earlier chapter, was already famous, a brilliant, persuasive, and supremely self-assured Englishman. The younger was Austrian-born Friedrich Hayek, 1899 to 1992, a quieter man with a formal, precise way of talking. After the outbreak of war, the London School of Economics, where Hayek was a professor, had been evacuated to Cambridge, and he ended up living in King's College. The two neighbours had very different responses to the catastrophes of the 1930s and 1940s. The mass unemployment around the world, and the rise of the Nazis in Germany, which sparked the Great Conflict and was the reason for their night on the roof. Nazism was, of course, a dreadful system of cruelty and murder. It's easier to believe that, while the Nazis were pure evil, the countries opposing them were completely different, good and just societies. Is it enough to leave it at that? Hayek thought not. In fact, he said something rather uncomfortable, even shocking. Yes, Britain and America were sworn enemies of the Nazis and fought and defeated them, though they had more in common with the Nazis than they'd care to admit. The German economy was tightly controlled by the Nazi government. In Britain, too, many believed that the government should run things. Hayek said that this belief could eventually lead to complete control of the government, not just of the economy, but of life in general. The end result would be totalitarianism, a society in which the government is all-powerful and requires everyone to be totally obedient to it. If you disobey, you face prison or even death. It happened in Germany, and if people weren't careful, it could happen to Britain too. How could Hayek compare Nazi Germany with free democratic countries like Britain and America? Surely the comparison is ridiculous. To understand what he was getting at, we need to look at what happened to the economies of Europe during the Second World War and after it. When the war broke out, governments took over. In Britain, the government ordered factories to produce more guns and aircraft for the military, and fewer ordinary goods like clothes and shoes. That meant that there was less for people to buy. Shoppers were allocated a fixed amount of basic goods, like butter, eggs, and sugar, rather than being able to purchase whatever they wanted with the money in their pockets. It was a big change to the normal system of free markets, in which the governments let firms make whatever they want, and people buy what they want and work wherever they want. But these extraordinary times and economic life couldn't continue as normal. A wartime poster said, "Increased British production, speed Nazi destruction." Government control of the economy helped to do that. Many people felt that the government should continue to play a big part in the economy once the fighting was over. And by the 1940s, economists had come to the conclusion that government had an important role, war or no war. Keynes had argued that the economy could get stuck in a state of higher unemployment with no way out on its own, and only the government could correct the problem. Many ordinary people had started to think along similar lines. You'd imagine that to pass the time in the air raid shelters, people would have turned to an exciting escapist novel. Surely the last thing that anyone would want to read about was economics and government finance. But at the height of the war, a best-selling book in Britain was a thick government report about just those things. It was called Social Insurance and Allied Services, and the night before it went on sale, people queued in the street to get a hold of a copy. Why were they so keen to read such a heavy-sounded book? Because they'd been gripped by the very idea that Hayek had warned about, that the government should be heavily involved in the economy. The report explained what the government was going to do after the war ended. It was written by William Beveridge, a well-known academic and writer who, when a young man, had worked helping the poor in London's East End. The report made him a national hero, and people flocked to hear him talk about it. But before the war, the government had helped the poor, but help was patchy. Beveridge wanted the government to properly protect people from the uncertainties of markets, from losing their jobs, not having enough to feed their children, and so on. The government had to battle 5 giant evils: want, disease, squalor, ignorance, and idleness. It would set up a system of social security that would support the unemployed and the sick. It would provide hospitals, schools, and housing, and it would follow economic policies that helped to create jobs. Hayek disagreed with this vision of the economy. His mentor had been Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist we met in chapter 16, who said that socialism could never work. But Beveridge and Keynes, who hadn't proposed a socialist economy. The post-war economy was a mixed economy, a middle way between capitalism and socialism. The government owned big industries like coal and railways, controlled the prices of some goods, and paid for schools and hospitals, giving the economy a socialist flavour. But a strong capitalist tang remained. There was a large number of privately owned firms ruled by profit. Hayek rejected the compromise. He said that state control of the economy would deprive people of their freedom, even under the middle way of the economic policy. Hayek rejected the compromise. He said that state control of the economy would deprive people of their freedom, even under the middle way of the mixed economy. The problem, as Hayek saw it, was the spectacular economic progress of the last few centuries that had given people a sense of power. The progress had been generated by the thousands of markets that made up an economy, which weren't created by any one person. People became impatient and want quicker progress. Governments sought to interfere with markets in the hope of developing the economy faster. Why would this destroy freedom, especially if it's designed to free people from economic hardship, as Beveridge hoped it would? It does, thought Hayek, because people have different desires and disagree about which ones are most important. Some people want more art galleries, others more swimming pools. It's impossible to reflect every person's desires in a single plan. If the government takes control of the economy, it ends up deciding for you. You're no longer able to choose, and your personal freedom gets trampled on. Hayek said that the loss of freedom could even cost you your life. The last resort of a competitive economy is bailiff, he said, when the ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. What he meant was that in a free market economy, you're lazy. If you're lazy, you lose your own money by getting fired or by making a loss. If things go really badly, the worst that can happen is that an official of a law, a bailiff, could give your possession to the people you owe money to. In an economy controlled by the state, if you do your work badly, you don't lose your own money but that of the nations as a whole. The entire community pays for your mistakes. You can't repay your fellow citizens with your own possessions because the state owns everything. You must pay by going to prison or, in an extreme case, with your life. What begins as an attempt to get rid of the unfairness of capitalism ends in tyranny. For Hayek, it wasn't enough for Britain to fight the Nazis with tanks and planes or with shovels. It had to fight them with ideas too. The idea that had to win was that of economic freedom, for the government to let people decide what to do with themselves. Without economic freedom, people can't think for themselves anymore. The government tells you what to do and what to think and how to live. Hayek made his warning towards the end of the war in his book, Road to Serfdom. He felt that he had to write it to warn people of the danger, even though he knew that it would annoy a lot of them. Hayek said that if we allowed the government to control us, we'd end up rather like medieval serfs, peasants controlled by a lord, who weren't allowed to decide anything for themselves. Modern Western civilization itself was based on the freedom of the individual, said Hayek. If we forget that, then civilization might collapse. Hayek's book was a sensation and rather more fun to read than Beveridge's, and it made him famous. The British wartime Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader, Winston Churchill, mentioned it in a radio broadcast during the 1945 election campaign. He criticised the opposing Labour Party's policy of having the government run the economy, comparing them to Hitler's ruthless secret police, an echo of Hayek's warning about big government. But the book did annoy a lot of people. It came out just as economists were coming to a firm belief in the importance of government being involved in the running of the economy. Hermann Feiner, one of Hayek's colleagues at the London School of Economics, called the book sinister and bigoted, as opinion moved away from him. Hayek abandoned economics. He became famous again a few decades later when free market economics were back into fashion. See chapter 29. In the end, bigger governments in Western democracies didn't lead to a new Hitler, although Hayek didn't say that it inevitably would do so, only that it would take us closer to that point. Today, most economies are a mix of private business and government action. Much of the debate among economists is about where to draw the line. Hayek drew it further towards the free market than most. But he said that government spending in the economy was needed to guarantee a basic living to the unemployed and to prove goods that market can't. It wouldn't threaten freedom if done sparingly. This brought ridicule from those who thought he hadn't gone far enough. The free market philosopher Ayn Rand scored rude comments about Hayek in the margin of her copy of The Road to Serfdom. He was an ass and an absurd fool. Most economists today disagree with Hayek's basic position that more government means less freedom. When the government provides schooling for every child, surely it increases people's freedom. When people can read and write, they can understand they can participate fully in society. They can get good jobs and understand the policies of the leaders who they vote for. After the war, spending by governments on health and education help disadvantaged groups like women and black people like never before and enable them to shape their lives. In the end, much of the debate comes down to what we mean by freedom. A difficult question that economists often leave to others. For Hayek, it had to be faced head-on. It was a central question, not just for philosophers, but for economists as well.